In the last few books I've written, especially the director, and before that Till, it was a strange process, kind of new for me. The thing I Well, actually no. Now I have to correct myself. In a way, it was always a little bit like that, but it intensified that I got interested in creating a certain world and a certain atmosphere. And that was there before the characters. So I had a certain, I don't want to say vision, that sounds a little bit too like heavy, but I had a certain general sense when I wrote Till that I wanted to write something set in the world before Enlightenment, in a world full of fear and demons, or I mean, people believing in demons, which is pretty much the same thing, and superstition and curses and a world of constant insecurity and fear. And in a similar way, when I wrote the director, um, I got really interested in the story of Pabst, about which we can and will probably talk. His strange story is a way for me to get into that world of the Third Reich, that completely strange, weird, absurd, and sometimes even absurdly funny, dark, funny world of the totalitarian state. So it was more, the first thing was kind of, or the strongest pull was the wish to write something set in that strange, alien, and, well, let's say still quite distant world. And the characters came after that. And in a way, that's why I was correcting myself when I wrote, for example, Measuring the World years ago. It was the same thing. I was really interested in the characters, but the strongest pull on me was that I wanted to write, or that I had a certain, yeah, I'll say it again, vision of a light comedy about scientists set in the time of enlightenment. So it was, again, it was an idea of an atmosphere that the book should have that preceded all the other decisions, if that makes sense to you. I was always interested in these stories of exiles and German exiles, and especially those coming to America, and especially then those creating the Hollywood that we know of. That because modern Hollywood was in large part created by these exiles from Germany and Europe, of course. Lots of them also came from Hungary, some came from France. So it's not just Germany, and a lot, of course, from Austria, like Pabst and also Fritz Lang. Um, so I was always interested in that, but also I have to say, of course, many books have been written about that, and many films have been made about them. So it wasn't something that was on my radar, something I wanted to write about, just because I felt, yeah, I mean, I felt that has been dealt with so many times by lots of writers and filmmakers and playwrights. Um, and so initially, I wanted to do something else, which is write about the silent movie era in Germany in the 20s. And then I found this strange detail that G.W. Pabst, I mean, it's more than a detail for me, but it always came up as a small detail in some film histories, that Pabst had made it to Hollywood and then went back to make films for the Germans, for Joseph Goebbels. And that was when everything fell into place for me. I felt I want to write about that. That's the story I want to write about, because I can start, and I had the idea immediately, an idea of a structure. I can start in Hollywood among these exiles, and it's a very interesting world and a very interesting milieu I want to write about. And yes, some readers would probably think this is nice, but this is kind of stuff that we've read about. This is the book we already know. He has written a book of which we have read some of that kind, and then suddenly everything would turn around, and one of these people who have recurrent nightmares of still being trapped in Nazi Germany would actually turn around and go back to Nazi Germany. And this is, of course, the turn that I could only get from this story because I don't think anyone else did that. And so that made it possible for me to connect both things, to write the slightly conventional part about exiles in Hollywood, and then the hopefully really unconventional part about one of them going back to, yeah, to darkness. The fact that he was one of the inventors of modern movie editing didn't mean that he would get the right to edit his own movie, which is kind of insane, but that's not a peculiarity of his case. That's just how the studio system worked. Um, and so at some point, it's pretty likely because the Nazis did this kind of thing. They did it with Thomas Mann too, who then was in Switzerland and then in southern France in exile before he came to America. They got in touch and said, "You're not Jewish." I mean, that was a deal breaker for them, obviously. "You're not Jewish. You could come back and work with us and be honored and be considered a national German treasure. You would have to make some adaptations, but this is something that we would offer you." And I think just because Pabst went back to Germany, even if it was only even if it was only intended to be a very short trip, some kind of communication of that sort must have happened, because otherwise, how would he have known he wouldn't get arrested right away? And he knew that. So, and then I also thought, if you're a director and you have to convince people of your vision all the time, otherwise you can never even do your art. Like, I mean, we can always sit down and write our books as long as they don't arrest us. But for a director, you actually need a system to give you resources, to give you either it's a privately financed system or a nationalized system, but you need to get a lot of resources from someone before you're actually allowed to do what you do. And I think there's not a director in the world who wouldn't feel a certain temptation when they're told you can do whatever you want and you have free reign and we will give you all the resources you need. And so then when so first he goes back, he only wants to visit his mother, look after his family, look after his country estate, but he knows that in the background there's this offer. It is there. And so he probably doesn't even know himself how much of a temptation this really is, but it is a real temptation. And then, and that's also, I think that's pretty much what happened. He gets forced to make films. The Nazis actually, the minister, they put real pressure on him. They say, you can't be here and not make films. You have to do this. And so he still tries to delay, tries to gain time. But at some point, he can't delay anymore. And then he suddenly realizes that there's an element to this that he really enjoys. he he has more creative freedom than he had in Hollywood, which is crazy, but that's actually a fact of Pabst and other movie makers who didn't go to exile in Nazi Germany, that they had an astonishing amount of creative freedom and were not forced to make propaganda. And so it's really, and suddenly he wants to make good films because of all the things they offer him. And he has become part of Nazi cultural, the cultural world of Nazi Germany. And it's a long road made of small steps. And each one of them, I have to say, makes sense to me and I feel is defensible. But of course, the whole road leads to a place that's not defensible. And that's kind of the paradox of it. That's the paradox of complicity and collaboration.